A word of caution that most reefers hear in their first years in the hobby is that their tanks will go through an ugly stage, basically meaning that their aquariums will look like crap for a little while before they become beautiful and mature. Although this fact is widely accepted amongst the reefing community, nobody really tells beginners what process is actually happening in their tanks during the ugly stages and how that process is the exact same one that nature uses to build its ecosystems. My name is Julia, and my goal in this video is to change your mindset about the ugly stage and make you see it from an educated standpoint so that you can be one of the few reefers that knows exactly what's going on and exactly what to do. So what is the ugly stage? The ugly stage is characterized as a point in the tank's lifespan, a stage if you will, where instead of growing the beautiful corals that we want, it harbors the display of nuisance algae which look undesirable and ugly in our aquariums. These nuisance algae could be diatoms, cyanobacteria, dinoflagellates, and other types of unicellular algae that take over our rockwork and our structures in the aquarium. The ugly stage can typically last anywhere from 3 weeks to 3-4 months. The ugly stage has reefers going nuts about the algae, and they're tempted to start dosing chemicals to get rid of the algae. But that is one of the worst things you can possibly do in an early aquarium that's so young and vulnerable to stuff that you add to it. And that way, you're never going to get to point B. Let me explain. Our goal in reefing is to get from point A to point B. Point A being a newly set up aquarium where we have rocks and sand and water, and basically no fish, corals, or anything alive in it yet. And point B is our dream tank, the one that has a lot of mature coral colonies and it has fish and it harbors healthy algae and also coralline algae on the rocks and sand. That means that whatever is in between we have to be ready for and expect to have been in our aquariums, and that just so happens to be the ugly stage. But it's just a phase, and eventually you will get to that dream tank by a process called ecological succession. So ecological succession is a process in which a completely barren landscape becomes into a beautiful climax community, which a climax community is basically just a diverse ecosystem that has reached equilibrium. So it has reached its carrying capacity, and that area cannot possibly harbor more animals and more plants in it than it already does. A climax community is a diverse ecosystem and it has an established food web. It's remarkable how nature is able to do this, and of course the process of ecological succession takes a long time, often sometimes taking decades to form a climax community. So ecological succession starts off with species that come to colonize the bare rocks on the empty terrain. These species are often very simple in their morphology, they are opportunistic, they reproduce in high numbers, and they are not picky in what they eat for nutrition. And in fact, most of these species are actually autotrophs. That means that they make energy from the sun, so they don't even need to eat anyways. The barren landscape is a very harsh environment because there's not a lot of water, there's not a lot of resources, there's oftentimes not even soil at first because it's just bare rocks that the ecological succession starts off from. So they basically have to find a way to survive in this very harsh environment. And oftentimes, these species are called pioneer species. Pioneer species have all these characteristics that I just described that helps them survive in a harsh environment and helps set the stage for new species to succeed over them. The definition of pioneer is something or someone that comes to explore and colonize a new area for the first time. And we could look at the example of American pioneers on the Oregon Trail when people, which were called pioneers, they came in covered wagons through the Oregon Trail to West America to find new land and to colonize there. So that's basically what a pioneer is. And species that are pioneers, they are colonizers. Ecological succession has 3 main stages, where first is the pioneer stage, where these pioneer species, like we talked about, they come and they colonize and they first set the stage for new species to succeed over them. The second stage is the successionist stage, where intermediate species will come and they'll take over the pioneer species, further increasing biodiversity and complexity of that ecosystem that is still developing. And third is the climax stage, where so many species have succeeded each other and they've grown upon each other, that now the area that was once a barren landscape has so much biodiversity, and it's reached climax, which is a community that has a lot of like trees. Maybe it could have like a whole ecosystem, a whole food web that's going on, and it's reached its carrying capacity, which means that all the species are living in equilibrium, and the system cannot possibly advance further up. It can only stay and maintain equalized levels and balanced levels within that ecosystem. So now let's look at a few examples. First, let's start with the terrestrial example, which I think is the most simple example to understand ecological succession, in where it happens in a terrestrial environment. So first of all, you'd see that terrestrial ecological succession starts off with bare rocks, like the hard rocks, no soil, almost no life to it. And the pioneer species that first colonize this area are lichens. Lichens are very simple organisms, and they're basically an alga and a fungus combined in a mutualistic relationship. The algae helps out the fungus to photosynthesize and make food and glucose for it, and the fungus helps it give structure and makes it grow on the rocks where it's on. And this relationship makes it a very hardy species, and it makes it like a very strong species that can colonize an area very easily and colonize a very harsh area for that matter. These lichens, they will grow on the rocks, and what they'll do is they'll actually secrete a biological acid that will start to dissolve the rocks, and it takes a very long time for this to happen. And while it's dissolving the rocks, the lichen will form networks of roots or holdfasts, which are not exactly roots, but they're structures that hold onto the rock and make it penetrate the rock so that it can hold onto it and it can grow on top of hard things. And as this process is going on, the rock is deteriorating. So furthermore, the rock deterioration happens during dry seasons and wet seasons. So as it's raining in the winter time, or maybe as it's raining, the lichen will actually expand to absorb water, and the holdfasts that are inside the rock are also expanding, which causes the rock to stretch and break apart. And then when the lichen dehydrates, when there's no rain, the lichen will shrink down and the size will decrease of the lichen. So that further causes the rock to kind of break and deteriorate, because the lichen is expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting, and it's also secreting more and more acids to break down the rock as the lichen is maturing. So this way, the rock is turning into sediment slowly and slowly over time. And also, lichens may die. So lichens, sometimes they'll die and they'll decompose, which add organic material to the sediment, which make it turn into soil. So lichens are among the first organisms that can colonize rock and actually make the rock, which is just a dead, hard thing, turn into soil, which has organic matter from the dead lichens, and it also has other sediments and minerals that are in the form of sand and slate. So that's how lichens break down rock. And then after lichens, in terrestrial succession, you'll see mosses. Mosses are a little bit more complex than lichens. Mosses are basically, they're in the family bryophytes. There are bryophytes, and mosses, they'll have structures that are similar to plants and ferns, and they'll grow on a mat of terrestrial soil. And after those mosses, you'll see other more complex species, like for example, flowering plants or ferns that will further colonize that area. And then after the ferns, you'll see small bushes. You'll see maybe more flowering plants with stems, or maybe some rooted plants. And then after those bushes, you'll see shrubs, and you'll see small trees, and maybe you'll see grasses form too. And then after those grasses and those small trees, you'll see bigger trees, and you'll see more animals. They'll come to the area to live in, because now those stages have created more and more of a complex community that can support the life of many animals and many organisms to come. And as you can see, in this process, the smaller organisms build on top of each other to make the area available for bigger and more complex organisms, like big trees and different types of plants, and more complex organisms and more complex flora and fauna, and which increases biodiversity. Oftentimes, these ecosystems will keep the intermediate species and the pioneer species still present in them, often containing the mosses and the lichens and all the species that have started it in the first place. That is basically how you create a climatic community. It takes a very long time too. And yeah, that is the terrestrial example. Another example of succession is something that's called pond succession, and this happens in aquatic environments. So if you can think of a pond, it's basically a divot in the land where there's water. And over time, that will actually turn into a terrestrial habitat by the process of succession. So how this happens is there is a pond, and colonizing species, which are the pioneer species like algae, they'll come to the pond and then they'll grow. And then eventually those species will die, maybe at the end of the winter or by the end of a season of their growth. They'll die and then they'll decompose in the pond. And then when they decompose, they'll settle out to the bottom and they'll turn into a layer of sediment. And over time, as more species come to live in that pond, the sediment layer will grow and grow and grow. And that sediment layer will support more complex kind of aquatic plants. It'll support maybe like lilies, not tiger lilies, but floating lilies that actually have their leaves out on the surface of the water. And furthermore, the sediment layer will grow and grow and grow as those lilies die and other types of aquatic plants die. They'll build onto that sediment layer until that sediment layer becomes very thick and the overlying water is maybe like a foot deep. At that point, the terrestrial pond is actually a wetland, and things like cattails will be growing out of it, and it'll support more emergent types of plants where the roots are in the water, but the main plant is outside of the water. And the sediment layer will continue to grow after that until the point where there's no water left and there's only sediment and there's only like a swamp or a wetland, and then eventually that will become terrestrial, because at that point there's no water left and the water would not have dried out, but it would have created such a heavy sediment layer that it will become terrestrial. And then after that, completely terrestrial plants will grow, like bushes and shrubs, and eventually trees, and eventually that pond, that area that was once a pond, will become a terrestrial habitat, and it'll blend into the rest of the environment, which was probably a terrestrial habitat to begin with. And that's the pond succession example. So the last example I want to relate to this topic of ecological succession with is the marine example. However, it's kind of rare to find examples of primary succession with marine environments because it's hard to identify an area where there is like no coral reef, because coral reefs, they date back millions of years. It's very hard to find an area that has not been colonized and has not been growing into a complex community. The only studies of ecological succession that have been done in marine environments was where maybe a volcano erupted or a very severe natural disaster has occurred and the coral reef has to start all over again. But if the process happens where maybe a volcano erupts over a coral reef, like say in the tropical areas or in the, I forgot what it's called, but in the area of fire where there's a bunch of volcanoes, if a volcano erupts and it covers a coral reef, succession will probably go as follows, where there's colonizing algae, there's a boom of cyanobacteria, and then more filamentous algae form, and then crustose coralline algae form, and then it brings the introduction of coral colonies and more fish start to colonize it, and then you have a coral reef again. But there's very few examples of this happening because it's not been documented a lot because of the rarity, where you can't really find a coral reef in its beginning stages. You can only look at coral reefs that are mature. So those three examples, what I have just explained, that is what's called primary succession, where a climax community forms from an area that was completely barren and there had no life to it. But there's also something called secondary succession, and secondary succession is a little bit different from primary succession, where secondary succession actually started with the climax community, but something happened to it, like a natural disaster, for example, a fire or a severe earthquake, destroyed that community, and it has to start all over again. With secondary succession, it doesn't take as long as primary succession because oftentimes you'll still have the soil layer underneath. For example, if a fire takes down a whole forest, You still keep the soil layer, but the species has to start all over again to create another climax community. So when we are building aquariums, what are we doing? We are introducing a blank slate for ecological succession to occur. And what kind of ecological succession? Well, obviously primary succession, because we start off with the bare rock and no previous life to it. How are we doing this? How are we introducing the bare rocks to our aquariums? When you put rocks in your aquarium, especially dry rocks, and you make a whole scape, you are basically introducing a blank slate for nuisance algae and pioneer species to come and to colonize on it. You're basically making free real estate for these pioneer species to come and colonize your rock. These pioneers include diatoms, cyanobacteria, dinoflagellates are in the water column mostly, but also other types of nuisance and unicellular algae that will grow on the rocks. And what I've just described, doesn't that sound exactly like the ugly stage in your reef aquarium? Well, it is, and the ugly stage in reef keeping is basically just a dishonoring name given to replace the colonizing stage in ecological succession. The colonizing stage in ecological succession harbors the growth of all these pioneers that come and start building the life in your coral reefs, which means that it is inevitable that you will go through an ugly stage because cyanobacteria, diatoms, and unicellular algae are pioneers to natural succession, which is the process that you are going to go from point A to point B, the empty aquarium to the beautiful mature aquarium. Succession is ultimately the only way that you are going to build that beautiful climax community in your reef tank. A climax community in a mature reef tank resembles a coral reef in the wild, where there are many mature coral colonies present, there are many fish serving important roles in their ecological niches, and there is a wide variety of inverts and different types of algae and organisms growing on the rock. And most importantly, this system grows coralline algae. Coralline algae is a hallmark of a mature coral reef. But the only way you are going to get coralline algae in your aquarium is if you allow it to succeed the other ugly algae. The order of succession in a reef tank often occurs in this order, where first you start with a bloom of diatoms or cyanobacteria or other unicellular algae that are simple, and then you'll go into filamentous algae, which will start to colonize your rocks, and then finally the crustose coralline algae, which will fill in sparsely and then eventually grow in more as the tank matures and as the tank gets older and older and older. Coralline algae simply can't start before the other algae because the other algae have to make a environment that supports the growth of the coralline algae. Otherwise, it will not be able to colonize it first because coralline algae is not a pioneer species, and it is a species that is characterized by being present in more of the mature stages in the coral reef. This means that you have to do your part and not be tempted to mess with the ugly algae once you see it. And this doesn't mean to completely let it overrun your tank if it so happens to be that algae is a problem in your aquarium. But it also doesn't mean to completely eradicate all of the ugly algae the moment you see it. You have to be able to keep a moderate amount of ugly algae present in your aquarium during the ugly stage so that coralline algae and other more desirable species will have something to succeed over. You still have to do some maintenance and cleaning if you have a lot of algae and it's starting to overtake the corals. But that's only if you have a lot and it's starting to cause problems in your aquarium. Now I want to share with you what I did to my tank because I did actually experience a bloom of cyanobacteria in the start, and I did clean it, and I want to share with you why I cleaned it and how I cleaned it. So this is the cyanobacteria that's been taking over my tank for a little while. As you can see, the characteristics of it looks like a film, and it just covers the surfaces of the aquarium, like the back wall and the rocks. And as you can see by the presence of bubbles, it also photosynthesizes, meaning it makes oxygen gas, and the bubbles will actually form underneath the film, and then it'll get so buoyant that the bubbles will push the layer towards the surface of the water, where the film will actually rip from the rock and then it will collect in the tank. And the film came off really easily if you just brushed your finger against it or touched it. So it didn't really have a defined structure, and it was more like a jelly, wispy-like film instead of a filamentous type of algae, so that's how I knew it was cyanobacteria. The bubbles made it look really gross because it would carry the cyanobacteria around everywhere in the aquarium. So that's when I decided to do some cleaning on this aquarium to control the growth of the cyanobacteria and not let it take over my tank and cover up the corals. I also cleaned it as a way of exporting organic matter from my aquarium, which will prevent more cyanobacteria from growing and causing eutrophication in my aquarium, which is basically dirtying up of the aquarium. I also was hoping to speed up the process of succession with the removal of cyanobacteria, because if I remove the cyanobacteria, it'll encourage other species of algae to come and grow on my rocks, continuing the cycling and the succession process. And looking back now, that is exactly what happened. I'll show you the results of other algae growing and succeeding the cyano near the end of the video. So now, how did I clean the cyanobacteria? I basically just blasted it off the rocks with a power head. I pointed a power head in the direction of the cyano on a certain spot of my rockscape and let it dislodge it by the strong current. Now, depending on the strength of your powerhead/wave makers, you could leave it entirely up to them to blow off all the gross stuff, but since mine are only rated for a 30-gallon tank, I also went in with my hand to brush off the rest of the film. I only used a feathery light touch and absolutely no scrubbing with cleaning tools because a light brush off the rocks was all it needed to get the cyanobacteria off. And as much as I don't like the look of the ugly cyano film, it's important to preserve the networks it has growing on the inside of the rock's pores and at least keep that biofilm intact. This way, we aren't completely disturbing the cycling process that's going on deep inside the rocks. I really recommend this method with the power heads because it allows for cleaning without complete destruction of the pioneer species. I also recommend any other method of cleaning that uses physical changes and not chemical changes to get rid of algae. Physical changes could be manually removing it, sucking it up with a siphon, or using utilitarian fish or inverts that will help graze algae off the rocks. But just keep in mind, if you have cyano, fish or inverts don't really eat this stuff, so they'll be useless in the fight against cyanobacteria, but they will eat hair algae and other types of filamentous algae. With that being said, the powerhead method is the best physical removal method out there for cyanobacteria and also scrubbing it off the rocks. If what you're dealing with is a bit tougher than cyanobacteria though, you could use an old toothbrush to help you get it off. And I know I said not to use cleaning tools if you can, but if you have a really stubborn hair algae problem, a toothbrush wouldn't do that much damage to the underlying roots of the algae, but it'll definitely help with the top. Now, during the powerhead process, the water will get dirty and hazy indefinitely. However, it won't stay like that for long because the material that you are blowing off turns into a suspension in the water column, where a suspension is a large particle that doesn't dissolve in water and will settle out to the bottom over time. Now, in our aquariums, the majority of the suspended matter won't actually go to the bottom because if you have a sump, the water between the tank and the sump is constantly being circulated, meaning that the majority of the suspended matter will be caught by the filter socks, other mechanical filtration, and the protein skimmer. When you've blown off all the cyanobacteria and when the water has gotten clearer, all that's left to do is clean the filter socks that have been catching all the gunk and export the skimmate from the protein skimmer's collection cup. At the end of this procedure, you will have no nuisance algae, clear water, you would have exported organic matter and allowed new algae, hopefully now coralline algae, to succeed over the nuisance algae. As your tank is going through the process of ecological succession and you are cleaning off algae blooms, it's not uncommon to see it come back within a couple days or weeks after blowing it off with a powerhead. But if this does happen, the next time algae or cyanobacteria comes back, it will not be as bad as it was before. For me, it came back a week later, but in a thinner, more compact, and less wispy film. What you can do now is just simply blow it off the rocks again if it ever comes back. So the results of my cleaning were very good. I didn't completely destroy all of the cyanobacteria because I didn't use anything chemical. I only used physical changes to dislodge the top of it off of the rock surface. As you can see now, I have a more beautiful aquarium. It still has some cyanobacteria, but also more importantly, it has other types of algae growing on it, like for example, this hair algae that I've seen growing in sparse areas on my rock. And that is a very good thing because it means that succession is occurring, just like I've predicted, with other more complex algae starting to form on my rock. I also see a small bit of bubble algae, and this algae is considered a nuisance algae and a pest. So if I do see problems with it in the future, I will deploy the use of emerald crabs to start to clean it up. And that will further increase my biodiversity as I start to add more organisms to it, which will combat the growth of other nuisance algae. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something from it, and I hope I did change your mindset about the ugly stage and how it's actually ecological succession. It's not just like a bad thing that happens in your aquariums, it's actually a process that undergoes a lot of different stages, and it's a very complex cycle that turns a barren landscape into a beautiful climax community. Thank you guys for watching my video, and I'll see you in the next one.